Today, I titled the message, Sight of Truth. Pastor Steve talked last week about the voice of truth and who are we listening to when things get tough or when things are going on in our lives. Are we listening for Jesus? Is that the voice we are listening to? So we're continuing along with that same series, I guess, but the sight of truth. It doesn't really have quite the same ring to it as voice of truth, but today I want to talk about sight. What are we seeing? And today we're going to be looking in Matthew 14, 13 through 32. Sometimes I take from like all over the Bible, but today we're staying in this one place. So talking about the sight of truth, where do we fix our eyes? The author of Hebrews tells us to fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Are we fixing our eyes? Are we focusing our gaze on Jesus? Or are we focusing on ourselves? Sometimes I think we have so much going on within us that it's hard to look outside of ourselves, but we are focusing not on Jesus. We're focused on us and our limitations and just who we are. Or are we focusing on our circumstances? So not looking at Jesus, not necessarily focused on us, but looking at everything that's going on around us. Maybe in our personal lives or maybe in the lives of those we love. When people around us are going through really hard things, is that what we are focusing on? Or the things going on in the world? There's a lot of stuff going on. Is that where our focus is? So the answer is we should be fixing our eyes on Jesus. But I want to take a look at two stories of Jesus with his disciples and where they were putting their focus to see if that is what we are doing also. So we're going to jump in. This is Matthew 14. And it says, as soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed and followed on foot from many towns. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So I want to pause right there. That's like the intro into these events that happen with Jesus and his disciples. And it says how it starts off, as soon as Jesus heard the news. The news that Matthew is writing about here is John the Baptist being beheaded. So Jesus' cousin was just murdered. And Jesus left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. I think we can all sympathize with that feeling of wanting to be alone when something bad happens. Sometimes we forget that when God took on human form and became in the form of a man, he knows what we are going through. So we can't lose sight of he is God, but he also understands. And I still like, there he is, overwhelmed with this news, but he sees all these people. And it says he had compassion on them and healed them. So while he was human, he was still God and still pushed through those human emotions and did what he had to do. Continuing on, so Matthew 14. Jesus had been healing all these people, and that it says that evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves. So let's pause there. That seems very logical. It's late. The people are going to be getting hungry. Let's wrap this up and tell them to go, be on their way. So Jesus was already in an emotional state. His cousin was dead. He had been healing and working all day, and the disciples are logically bringing something to his attention. But here's what he says. It says, but Jesus said, that isn't necessary. You feed them. But we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. So Jesus is looking at this situation, and he tells his disciples, you take care of it. And here they are, looking with their eyes, but we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. They are focused on what they themselves have. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That is not enough in human standards to take care of all the people that were there and all the people that needed to be fed. So they're a little bit stressed. Continuing on, verses 18 and 19. Jesus says, "Bring them here." Then he told the people to sit down on the grass. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up toward heaven, and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples, who distributed it to the people. So the disciples only had a limited resource, not enough for what needed to be accomplished. And Jesus says, "Bring it to me." As individuals, God has given us gifts, talents, relationships, time. God has given us a lot of things. And sometimes God is calling us to do something big. Sometimes he's just calling us to do small things because he needs obedience in small things too. But God is calling us to do stuff. And how often do we look at ourselves and say, I can't do that. That's not me. I don't have enough, insert whatever. I don't have enough time. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough talent. I just don't have enough. And instead of fixing our eyes on what God is calling us to do and fixing our eyes on Jesus, we fix our eyes on our own limitations because it seems like this can't happen. Find someone else. Send them somewhere else. Somebody else can take care of it. And yet when Jesus said, "Bring it to me," the disciples obeyed. The disciples obeyed. They took what they had to him, and look what he did. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, broke it into pieces, and gave it to the disciples, who distributed it to the people. Let's keep going. It said they all ate as much as they wanted, and afterward the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. So the disciples took what they had to Jesus. They obeyed and said, "Fine, here's what we have." And Jesus did a miracle. Jesus did something that does not make sense to the human mind. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish to feed 5,000 people, 5,000 men, plus all their wives, all their kids. That's pretty amazing. Are we willing to do the same thing? Are we willing to see Jesus? And when he calls us to do something, are we willing to say, "Okay, here I am. Eyes on you. Do it. Do what you want. I want to be used. I want to take what you've given me, and I want to do something for your kingdom." And what Jesus did, we can't even fathom. 12 baskets, they ate as much as they wanted. So it wasn't like they took a small bite. They ate as much as they wanted. And then there were still leftovers. So when we are fixing our eyes, we need to fix our eyes on Jesus, not on just our human limitations, on the what we see as not enough, as what we see somebody else with more time, more money, more talent, somebody else should do it. That's not what happens. Jesus said, "Bring it to me." So are we fixing our eyes on Jesus? Are we bringing what he has given us back to him and saying, "Multiply it for your kingdom, God"? Continuing on in the story, Matthew says, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. So the people were fed. There was a ton of leftovers. Jesus dismissed them, also told his disciples, "Hey, you guys go ahead." He needed his alone time. So remember, he started that day being upset because of the things going on in his life with his cousin passing. And because he was human and God, he knew where this was all pointing. It's getting closer to the time where he himself is going to be dying. So he sends his disciples off, and he goes up into the hills by himself to pray. Just another reminder of how important it is when we are overwhelmed that we need to be seeking God. Often we seek out other things that are easier or faster fixes, like mind-numbing things like scrolling through our phones, watching something on TV, just doing something else. But when we are burdened with things in life, we need to be pressing into God and seeking time with him. So it says, night fell while he was there alone. Continuing on in Matthew 14, this is verses 24 through 26. It says, meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. So he had sent the disciples in their boat. Remember, they were fishermen, so they were good at driving boats. And they were out on this lake, and it says they were in trouble. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." So this is a story that's, I think, pretty popular to teach to little kids. And I remember learning about this in Sunday school when I was younger, walking on water and how cool that would be. So this is a story that we are familiar with in terms of Jesus walking on water. But a couple things I want to point out. They were fighting heavy waves. A strong wind had risen. And it says about 3 o'clock in the morning. I think there's something about 3 o'clock in the morning, in that middle of the night, where the enemy really attacks. Where if you're still awake, bad things can happen. Because all of your defense mechanisms are weakened because you're tired, probably hungry, drained. And in that hour, there's a lot of crazy things that can go on. I also think it's interesting because I've heard from numerous people that if they have trouble sleeping, around 3 o'clock is the time they wake up and they can't fall back asleep. And I think there's a correlation between all the bad the enemy is trying to do in the middle of the night and when Christians are woken up and can't fall back asleep. Because maybe that's the time where we cry out to God. We don't even know what we should be praying for because all we really want to do is fall back asleep. But in that moment, maybe we take some time and we say, God, please be with. God will put someone, something, some situation on our heart or our mind in the middle of the night. And we use that time and reclaim it for the glory of God. So what the enemy meant to disrupt our sleep, make us tired, make us not able to function well the next day, we take that and reclaim it for God's glory. But it says 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them. So here's Jesus walking on water toward his disciples. Something literally miraculous is happening. And because it's 3 o'clock in the morning and because all of their fear and anxiety and stress and everything is going crazy, they cry out, "It's a ghost." So a miracle is happening in their midst and all they can think is, this is something bad. What is going on? That happens to us whenever we take our eyes off Jesus and put our eyes on the circumstances, on the wind, on the waves, on all the bad that is happening. When God starts to move, we might even miss it. Jesus is walking on water, and their first inclination wasn't, wow, look what Jesus is doing. Their first inclination is, there's a ghost coming to get us. We need to keep our eyes on Jesus so when God starts moving, we can be aware and we are ready to see what he has. Continuing on in Matthew, but Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid, he said. Take courage, I am here. Now that's a little bit old-fashioned language, but it still makes sense. Don't be afraid, I'm here. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the world was crashing down and the waves and the wind, Jesus said, don't be afraid, I am here. What a reminder to keep our eyes on Jesus. And then it says, then Peter called to him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water. This is so interesting because I like to think, what would we have done? Sometimes I think we want to give Peter a bad rap as we find out more of the story. But what would we have done? Jesus comes walking to us on the water. And Jesus said, yes, come. Let's keep going. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. Peter said, if it's you, tell me and I'm coming. And Jesus said, okay, come on. What would we have done? Would we have wanted to join in what God was doing in that moment? I mean, I get seasick, so I wouldn't even have been in the boat. But if we were in the boat and God is in the middle of doing something amazing, would we have said, take me with you? I want to do it too. Peter said, let me come. So Peter went over the side of the boat. I think that's a great way of describing it because I never really thought, like, how did he get from the boat into the water? He did have to go over the side. So you wonder, was his first step just straight on the water, or did he like go down and float back up and start walking? I don't know. But Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. So he's walking toward Jesus. His eyes are fixed on Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, this is also interesting too, because when I envision Jesus walking on water or Peter walking on water toward Jesus, for some reason I'm thinking like smooth, glassy sea. So you can like take nice steps and it just like ripples where your feet go. But it says when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he didn't step out into something calm where everything was controlled and prepared. He stepped out into the strong wind and the waves. His eyes were on Jesus and none of that other stuff mattered. Are we willing to do the same when Jesus says, come on? Do we keep our eyes on him or do we wait till everything is perfectly in line and we can be like, oh yes, now I'll come? We need to be willing to step out, get out over the side of the boat and walk toward Jesus, eyes on the prize, eyes fixed on Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. Peter takes his eyes off Jesus. He starts focusing on the wind and the waves. He gets scared and he starts to sink. I think we look at this story and we're like, dude, you were walking on water with Jesus. What happened? How did you suddenly get your eyes off the prize? But it's just like us. We start walking. The enemy's not going to give up and quit attacking. The things in our lives aren't suddenly going to get perfect. And where do we set our gaze? Save me, Lord, he shouted. Continuing on, Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? Jesus is reminding him, what happened? Why did you doubt me? Did you really think I was going to let you drown right there? I mean, I'm right here. We don't have the same privilege of seeing Jesus in a bodily form, however far from us, on waves and wind. But we have Jesus living in us. We have the Holy Spirit in us. There should never be a time where we should be so afraid that we take our eyes off Jesus and start to sink down. But we do. That's the reality of being human. We mess up. But I want to remind us today, we can't take our eyes off Jesus and put them on all the stuff going around us. We need to be fixing our gaze on him. When they climbed back into the boat, so picking back up, when they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. You really are the Son of God, they exclaimed. When we read those things where it's like the disciples are realizing more who Jesus is and who he says he is, we have the privilege of like hindsight, or we can see who Jesus was. We read the story knowing that Jesus was the Son of God. But this was their friend, the one they hung out with, ate with, traveled with. He was a great teacher to them. They traveled around with him, heard him speak, watched him heal. But they were still just learning about who Jesus is. And while we know who Jesus is because we have all of this written down for us, it's the same for us. The more time we spend with Jesus and see what he does and that he really is who he says he is, it is easier to fix our gaze on him. We cannot give up. The disciples worshiped him. You really are the Son of God. So when we are going through trials and the wind and the waves and Jesus comes through again and comes through again and comes through again, we cannot take our eyes off him. We need to be worshiping him, fixing our gaze on him. So I close us off. Sight of truth. Are we fixing our eyes on Jesus? Or are we fixing our eyes on ourselves and our own human limitations, like the disciples with the bread and fish? And we're like, well, this is all we have. What do we do? We need to come to God, ready to be used for all that he has for us. Or are we fixing our eyes on our circumstances, on the wind and on the waves and on how crazy everything is around us? Where do we fix our gaze? Soften our hearts to want you, God. Soften our hearts to hear you. Soften our hearts to obey you. Give us strength. Strength, God, to cling to you, to listen to the voice of truth and fix our eyes on you. Sight of truth, God. Use us for your kingdom, as you have said. Accomplish great things, God. Yes, Lord. We ask these things in your name. Amen. Have a great week. See you next week.